that shows that you did attend for today's webinar. It will be sent via the Adobe Connect thank you email as well. Please note that individuals who are virtually signed into today's webinar, meaning that you are actually virtually signed in, those are the individuals who will receive the certificate. So please make a note of that. If you are virtually signed in, please note that you will be able to receive your certificate. If you're not virtually signed in, unfortunately, you will not be able to receive your certificate for attending for today. But if you did attend and you have any questions, you can contact the help desk for any assistance as well. Please note that at the conclusion of today's webinar that we will provide you with a survey. The survey does help us to improve our training as well. And so with the approving of our training, it helps us to make our webinars better. So if you do get a survey, in that survey it does indeed allow for you to provide some feedback, then we would greatly appreciate it if you do provide your feedback as well, okay? Yeah. And then the last thing that I will do is check in with my colleagues to see if they are on as far as my hosts go. It looks like everyone is able to rejoin. So I would ask if, let's see, I think my colleague Adam is actually a host. If Adam could go in and start the recording. Oh, it looks like the recording is started. Great, perfect. And I won't go through my spiel here again, but I will do just a quick introduction since we are recording, just so I can have the title of today's webinar recorded for us. Again, you all are joining us for Responding to Gangs in Schools, Creating a Collaborative Process Between Schools and Law Enforcement. And again, this webinar, please be mindful, is indeed brought to you by our partners at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and also brought to you by the National Gang Center, and the Institute for Intergovernmental Research. With that being said, I will turn over today's webinar over to, oh, if I get to the right slide, my apologies, to our moderator, Steffi Rapp, to introduce our presenters today. Steffi, take it away. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steffi Rapp, as William said, and I'm a program manager at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Thank you for joining us today to talk about gangs in schools and how to build a strong collaboration between law enforcement and school administrators. I'm happy to introduce our presenters to you. First, you will hear from Nina Harris. Ms. Harris is an Executive Vice President of the Institute for Intergovernmental Research. In this role, she currently supervises the National Gang Center, which is operated for the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. She is also responsible for the Gang Resistance Education and Training, the GREAT program, National Program Office, for which IIR provides administrative and logistical support. Ms. Harris has been with IIR for almost 5 years and has over 20 years of experience in youth violence prevention, safe schools climate, substance abuse prevention, and criminal gang-related topics. Ms. Harris has a master's degree in sociology. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Oscar Harris, who's from Spokane, Washington, Public Schools Family Support, and he's the Public Schools Family Support and Community Engagement Coordinator. Mr. Harris has a master's degree in social work from Eastern Washington University and his school principal certification from Gonzaga University. Mr. Harris is currently pursuing a doctorate degree in transformational leadership. His research interests include community engagement and advocacy to marginalized families and improving the service delivery efforts of agencies. And finally, we'll hear from Captain William Alvosa, who began his law enforcement career as a patrol officer in 1985 with the Gainesville Police Department. He subsequently rose through the ranks and became a detective. He later led the Youth and Community Service Bureau and implemented policies to reduce school suspensions and contact between law enforcement and minorities. Our webinar objectives for today are to discuss the importance of responding to gangs within a school setting, describe the specific roles of law enforcement and school safety administration in developing a collaborative process around school safety, and to also identify ways to foster and sustain the collaboration between law enforcement and school administration. I'll now turn it over to you, Mina.
Thank you. So, thank you everyone for being here and joining this webinar. I hope you get something out of it. I wanted to talk about our Gangs in Schools Guide, which we released this year. And the Gangs in School Guide was designed to provide collaborative techniques to identify, to assess, and address gang activities in school. It provides guidance on how to create that collaborative approach in which schools and law enforcement can work together. It provides suggestions for the role of law enforcement and for the role of school administrators. The guide also provides considerations for prevention, intervention, and suppression-focused strategies within a school setting. For this webinar, because that's a lot, for this webinar we're going to focus on the collaborative process in which comprehensive strategies can be developed for individual schools. So before we jump into these topics, this topic of collaboration, let's set the stage on some of terms and some statistics. So as many of you may know, there's no universal definition of gangs. There are various definitional approaches through research perspectives. There are federal and state statutory definitions that define gang member, and gang-related criminal activity. If you'd like to research your state statutes that are related to gang status and criminal gang activity, you can go to our NGC website and look at the gang-related legislation database. We have a link up on that slide. Keep in mind, it's not illegal to be a gang member. When diagnosing, so the approach that we take when diagnosing your gang problem within your school and what to do about it, don't get hung up on definitions, what this research definition says or this or that. Focus on, self-identification of individuals as gang members. So if a student is claiming a gang, then they are self-identifying as a gang member. Focus on patterns of behavior, and this is key, patterns of behavior by both the gang-involved youth and the group that they associate with. So researchers may debate the definition of gang, but we find that in a school setting, the kids, they know about the gang presence in and around their schools, and the school resource officers who are in tune with the students at any given school, they know about the gang presence in a school. So in order to assess gang activity in and around schools at the national level, the School Crime Supplement to the National Crime Victimization Survey asked students ages 12 to 18 if gangs were present at their school during the school year in 2017. They asked about all gangs, whether or not they were involved in violent or illegal activity. About 9% of students reported there were gangs in their schools in 2017. Breaking this down further by urban, suburban, and rural areas, students reported higher percentages of gang presence in urban area schools. So to break this down even a little farther, the percentages of students in 9th through 12th grade who reported a gang presence at their school during the school year were higher than the percentages of students in 6th through 8th grade in 2017. About 11% of 9th and 10th graders and 10% of 11th and 12th graders reported the presence of gangs in their school. So I show this because this pattern of statistics corresponds to what we know through research, that the prevalence of gang involvement increases in late childhood, peaks in middle to late adolescence, and then decreases during the transition from middle adolescence to early adulthood. As a way to understand this process of gang involvement or gang joining, and at the same time as a way to view it as windows of opportunities to link age-graded programs from childhood to adolescence that support gang prevention and gang assistance is through this diagram developed by Dr. James Howell. And you can, as you look at it, research has established numerous risk factors that correspond with the life course process. The continuous influence of risk and protective factors at certain developmental stages is illustrated in this slide. The top section shows the major risk factor domains that influence a variety of youth behavioral problems: family, school, peer group, individual characteristics, and community conditions. So at birth or even beginning prenatal, the biological family is the central influence on infants and children. During preschool and especially in elementary school and onward, the array of risk factors expands as some children are exposed to negative influences outside of the home, particularly school problems and delinquent or gang-involved peers. Family, school, and peer influences continue from childhood to young adulthood, although family influences gradually fade as friends become more important. In addition, individual characteristics and community factors can come into play at any point during childhood or adolescence. In other words, risk factors accumulate with age and they become stacked on one another, contributing to multiple problems of behavior. So the type of prevention and intervention strategies applied throughout these developmental years should be targeted and informed. For example, social, emotional, and learning programs are effective for at-risk elementary age students. For middle school age children, they're effective coping and life skills programs and cognitive and behavioral regulation programs and other youth development programs. For later in adolescence, more intensive gang assistance intervention programs will be necessary for individual youth, and of course always keeping community and school safety as a paramount priority. More targeted suppression strategies might become necessary. So, how does all this affect the school environment and school safety? So nationally, we saw that percentages of students who reported that gangs were present in their schools, it's actually decreased from 2001. It's been a steady decrease from 2001 to 2018. In 2001, 20% of students in schools were reporting gang presence in their schools. Now, as we saw, it's about 9%. This is a good trend. However, where there is a presence in schools, a gang presence in schools, it can potentially create real unsafe and negative school environments. We're talking about disruption in the classrooms. We're talking about fear and intimidation in the hallways, cafeterias, and other places where students congregate. It affects school climate as well as individual educational outcomes, not only for those gang-involved students, but also for the students who've been victimized by gang-related activities or other gang-involved students. So it can't be ignored, or it'll grow. The problem will grow. So how do you change that? So how do you address it, right? So the Gangs in School Guide provides some best practice suggestions, some sound practice suggestions to address all these implications in the short and long term at both the individual student level and at the overall school climate level. Administrators working with law enforcement should focus on addressing gang activity at their school head on. Develop practices to build resiliency within the school environment that mitigate risk, which foster gang activity, and provide supports to those who are both susceptible to gang joining and susceptible to gang victimization. The ultimate goal is to ensure school and community safety and to provide supports for those youth, for all students, to promote successful outcomes both educationally and throughout their life course. There we go. So a framework for collaboration. So where do we start? If you go back to the guide, if you look through the guide, you'll see a wealth of information on suggestions that we've talked on all these pieces about mitigating and protecting and responding to gangs. It's very important. Awareness, understanding, and documentation of the gang issue in your school is the first step. You've got to know how to identify the gang-involved students in your school, but you must do it in a way that establishes an accurate picture of the level of disruption and the threat to school safety posed by gang activity, and at the same time, that a way that protects individual students from unsubstantiated labels. And we tell you in this guide that the best way to do this is done through sharing and validation of information between schools and law enforcement. Once you have a handle on what is really going on in your school, develop a range of prevention, intervention, and suppression strategies, and there's numerous suggestions in the guide. So administrators can't do this alone. The schools can't do this alone. It should not be considered their responsibility to do it alone. It really is the responsibility of everybody who has a stake in community safety, school safety, youth safety, and youth empowerment. The key to success is to develop collaborations among agencies and organizations that have that stake in community and school safety. So this is where I'm going to hand it over to Oscar and to Will, our key presenters, who both have experience in dealing with gang issues in their schools and how they are part of a collaborative process in responding to these types of gang-related issues. So thank you very much. I'm here for questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Oscar.
Yes, good morning, evening, not evening, but afternoon, I guess, depending on where you're at. First of all, I would like to say, Bina, thank you very much for giving a comprehensive overview in terms of when we're looking to try to provide intervention, prevention, and suppression, possibly services, to kind of deal with, I guess, the gang issue, as we may call it. So uniquely for my portion of the presentation, I would really like to try to give an overview and maybe go into a little bit of detail in terms of what happens within the school setting and various things of which administrators may have to deal with in terms of on a day-to-day basis as they're trying to serve oftentimes large groups of students. And uniquely before doing that, I'd first like to say that, my background is primarily in building, partnership, relationship, cross-community collaboration to sum it up. I've uniquely had the opportunity to work with various community organizations as well as federal entities that pretty much target certain type of at-risk behavior. Gang involvement is one of those particular things that we look at. And so when I'm sharing the presentation, please keep in mind that I'm coming from a lens of being, a school administrator, a district office administrator for, over a decade now, but I started previously in the community, which has given me, I think, a unique perspective on how the two type of systems can actually come together and to work. So to kind of start, something in particular I would like to do and kind of really surface so we'll have an understanding of the certain nuances that may be associated with talking about gang prevention or intervention as it relates to being schools, is that within schools, depending on your level, there's different roles that administrators may play, to be able to initiate those developmental appropriate responses to discipline. Because ultimately, when you begin to start looking at gang involvement or gang behavior to a great degree, you're talking about individuals who are going to address it will be individuals of which are going to be in student services within a school building. So I wanted to kind of look at that, and uniquely something I can tell you that as we've been looking at the shift that's been happening even in our region around how we're supporting families, how we're supporting, I'll say, victims of gang violence as well as what we've called perpetrators of gang violence. Something that's come very much into play is our ability to really begin to start focusing on that family and that community engagement and building those meaningful relationships between all stakeholders that's involved within the education systems as well as communication with the community systems, because ultimately all of it is interconnected, and you cannot disjoin it any manner and really get at what you're trying to get at as far as trying to provide holistic services for all families. So to kind of start, at the high school level to kind of, as from what I've seen as it relates to the administrator's role, that's in student services, they're handling discipline that is ranging from, it can be at a level of plagiarism, but to a great degree it goes all the way to the place to where what kind of violence is happening in the school that's making it unsafe for school staff as well as other students. And so their interaction with families, they have interaction with families, but one thing you will notice, and many people will be able to echo, the farther you go along or children go along in the education system, the less the parents are involved. You have different anomalies that do happen with families being involved, even more at the high school level, but that's rare. And so it automatically lends itself to providing a unique nuance to when you begin to start looking at gang prevention and other discipline. You're talking about an administrator who is working with someone who is entering into adulthood, but at the same, for all intents and purposes, have not quite made it to understand the consequences of their behavior. Even when you look at neuropsych and biology and everything, we look at the human brain, especially I'll say males in particular, it's not even fully developed even yet when they graduate from high school. So to move on, when you look at the middle school level, administrators who is working in student services, they are dealing with behaviors that's going to have to do with those preteens and actually teens or individuals who are just transitioning. In our region, back up a little bit, middle school currently is from 7th through 8th grade. And so they are transitioning out of the 6th grade, which in some areas that's considered middle school, but there are yet still elementary students, from my opinion, in many regards, but they're just starting to develop as much, and they're starting to develop their sense of autonomy. Family involvement is kind of there, but to what I've seen and what I've experienced is that it's not as much, and it becomes even more complicated because this becomes a very challenging time for families to begin to start working, to be working with their, I'm calling them kiddos, to be working with their children because of the different things that are happening. The social pressures that are happening, the school pressures that are happening, you will notice more instances of bullying happening, and you'll notice youth become even more impressionable. And so gang recruitment and different types of things can become a factor when you begin to start looking at the middle school as individuals are trying to develop their identities. And school administrators that handle discipline have to deal with all these nuances while keeping in mind that the students have not quite made it to that place to where they're settling even more as far as mentally and emotionally and physically as well. And lastly, looking at elementary school, which we are seeing a trend. We are seeing a trend in which some individuals have asked our elementary students involved in gang activity. I'll say to a great degree you will see it. It may look different from the other areas, but yes, they're involved because they're going to have peers. They're going to be impressionable as well, being followers of individuals in the community and stuff, and so you will begin to start seeing those elements. So I just want to give a quick brief view of that so we can kind of set the basis and the foundation as it relates to when we're talking about administrators, different roles at different levels. Next, another thing that is worth mentioning is that when we look at discipline within a school that administrators have to administer, whether we're talking about plagiarism and to violence that happens in a school, traditional models, as many individuals probably remember, have revolved around there being this cookie-cutter model in which individuals could actually look down a menu and say, oh, Johnny actually violated the rules in this particular area, so this is the consequence of punishment. That's changing because often many individuals know that that has been linked up to our school-to-prison pipeline or disproportionality that we're contending with and we're researching right now. Youth uniquely, while we're looking at traditional models, something that comes into play, administrators are being faced with how do I support youth while thinking outside the box, while trying to implement something Mina mentioned earlier as it relates to the social emotional learning, which under that heading would be your restorative practices, which lend themselves to helping you to really restore relationships, which which I have to argue, relationships are key whenever you're going to look at any type of intervention or any type of thing when you're trying to build upon having solid collaborations between schools, families, and the community. And so when we look at current discipline models, they pretty much are starting to, within our region, they are starting to really have elements of restorative practices to where we're, instead of saying let's remove individuals from the environment being the main premise of discipline, is getting to the place to where how do we bring a higher level of accountability and individuals to understand the type of harm that they've done, no matter what the gambit is as far as the behaviors. How do we repair the harm? Whether is it violence against the person or is it plagiarism? How do we do it? Which makes things very complex as it relates to addressing discipline, especially when you begin to start thinking about when it comes to gang-type behavior potentially. I want to say potentially because it's often, as Mina said, you can often misdiagnose whether or not someone's involved in a gang, around the gang, and all of that, but that we're not getting into that. That will probably come later. So uniquely, there's a complexity that has arose for school administrators, and I want to add to that complexity by saying that uniquely, when you build relationships even more with law enforcement agencies, something that comes into play is that you're now, it's even part of the framework, the safer framework, you're now going to be in a place to where as an administrator, you're going to have access to intel. And that intel, to a great degree, is going to affect your ability to take on a traditional role as an administrator in which you are implementing discipline. So that's something that's worth noticing. Even though it's very valuable intel, it can be somewhat challenging to figure out what do you do with it. And so that's also linked up with my next book, Responses to Incidents, how they impact the community. The notion or the idea that we can pay attention to what's happening just within schools without paying attention to what's happening in the community is becoming so archaic right now, to where we literally have to shift our paradigm to really get back to, different proverbs that it takes a village to raise a child, all those types of things, because in essence it really does. So next, what I wanted to do is kind of begin to start talking about, in lieu of all the challenges that has arose for school administrators, how do you yet build or create a supportive school climate, which, if you look at research, the school climate can dictate test scores, it can dictate academic achievement, it can dictate behaviors, it can dictate whether or not everybody feels safe in school, including staff members. So that's something that's worth knowing. So I would say administrators, another thing that must be added to what the job role, job title unofficially to an administrator is what resources do I need to broker to be able to really work with families and stuff, because we can't operate within vacuums, because often what ends up happening is when we come down to certain levels of behavior, law enforcement would be involved anyway. And something worth noticing is that even though there are similarities between law enforcement and school agency, there are also differences, but I recommend that when you're looking to build collaborations, begin to start trying to explore what is going to be those areas to where that both parties or both organizations or systems are really targeting, because that's where it's going to be an area to where it's going to be easier to build the collaboration. And part of what that's going to be is providing safety. So most of the relationship that I would say from my perspective that we have with law enforcement is around that. How do we keep individuals safe? With that being said, there's something that must happen, and I'll say it's foundational before you look to try to build relationships with organizations and entities, and that is taking time to try to understand the culture, the policies, and the practices of each organization, because if you don't know those particular elements, conflicts, you will not be able to get past the conflictual stages when you begin to start talking about group dynamics and relationship building. Next, Continuing with that, I will say uniquely as some examples within the Spokane context of different types of strategic partnerships that we have been able to build that has actually helped us with some of the data that I will be kind of showing a little bit later on, is us being able to have strategic partnership in programming. And what I mean by that, the great program that is offered definitely by the OJJDP and the Gang Institute to a great degree has helped us as we begin to start formalizing and building relationships and giving a framework in which we can begin to start initiating within the schools definitely prevention efforts. And what I mean by that, upon being part of the program, we had to our community resource officer or school resource officer, as they call sometimes, went through particular training around gang involvement, gang prevention, and et cetera, and actually brought the training back to schools, and we began to start integrating it within schools at certain levels to where, and we ultimately began to start seeing a turnaround as it related to students' involvement, behavior changes, as well as ultimately we began to start seeing different things shift as far as the mindset of our students. We have Anti-Gang Steering Committee, which is made up of various community organizations, including the schools, local law enforcement agencies, local faith-based community, as well as different service providers who end up providing insight to what's happening with their clientele, as well as it gives the opportunity for everybody to begin to start supporting the systems, which end up turning out to be the best thing for youth, because ultimately one thing I would have to say, digressing, the fragmentation of the systems, them not being able to work together, serving the same clients, can actually do a disservice to families. So another thing we have is the Youth Police Initiative, to where we have police department have officers who actually linked up with school-age children, and they began to start sharing their stories and stuff to build closer relationships, which began to start bringing down the fear between law enforcement and students. We have Police Action League, Activities League, which is typically goes during the summer months to keep kids involved, and we partner with the police department, local police department, to kind of supply resources as far as children and even our CROs. And we have Mentoring Today's Youth to kind of sum it up, which is a community organization that was spurred by a faith-based community leader who has extensive knowledge about working with gang-affected population and individuals who are involved in gang activity. Next, in terms of looking at how we was able to really foster the relationships, and I think something that's even more important is when you're thinking about fostering relationships, you also want to be keeping in the back of your mind what it means to sustain them, because it's oftentimes everybody get excited when it's time to start things. It's sustainability that I think most individuals have challenges with. And to accomplish this, I say you have to work closely with law enforcement agencies or within the school resource officers to begin to start jointly coming together with a vision of what collaboration should look like and can look like within the confines and boundaries of each organization and agencies. Overcoming challenges. For administrators, something that becomes important as these relationships are being built, administrators have to change the mindset to say that I have to be more involved in the community for the whole purpose of being able to foster a safer and more positive learning environment for all students, because at the end of the day, it's all students that we're tasked with working with. So uniquely, when I'm talking about formalizing and sustaining collaborations and partnerships, something that becomes, I'd say, of great value is to pay attention to the formal ones as well as the informal ones. Informal partnerships is that meeting up for coffee, you knowing someone maybe personally who may work across systems in the school or police department, but to a great degree, there is no outline or no blueprint that's going to pretty much guide you during some of the tough times. So we're looking at memorandum of understanding and data sharing agreement, which can be necessary in the event when you're talking about working together to help individuals to understand what's happening within your system. And for school system, we're governed by FERPA, and so we have to be careful in terms of information we share, but when there's memorandum of understanding, data sharing agreements, and different type of consent forms have been signed, you can get around those different types of things to better serve families. Another thing is who you're establishing these agreements with. Oftentimes, it's going to be key stakeholders who you're going to be working with even more consistently, who there's a possibility of some type of litigation following some of your actions. Truthfully, that's something, because the ultimate purpose is to be able to give you more access to information to help you make better decisions to become ultimately even more efficient, if that makes sense. The process, as I know it within our system, is that we have individuals within the school district who works on MOUs as well as other contracts, and within governmental organization they typically have them, and you end up connecting your attorneys and et cetera, and they write out a plan to outline specifically what you're looking to actually do. So uniquely, I shared earlier that we would share some of the data. One thing that I would say kind of contributed to a change in our arrest data within Spokane Public Schools, because if you note, 2015, 2016 from the slide, we had like 806 type of arrests, and then you look a year later, 2016, 2017, we went from that number down to 117. A few factors came into play. One thing is that we have wonderful relationships that have been formed. Another thing that came into play is that internally, since we've focused our efforts on looking at social emotional learning, restorative practices, it changed the mindset of how we work with behavior, and we added interventions such as mentors to target high-risk behaviors was another element that really helped us to get at these numbers. So as I'm concluding, something that I want to kind of share that I think is very worth noting is that looking at lessons from the field is I would tell you, take time to really develop the memorandums of understanding and data sharing agreements, because when you need them, you need them. When you don't, you don't. But when it's time to look at them, you want them to be concise and to specifically outline what you're looking at. Another thing is monitor potential conflict in political interest. I'll say in particular, because we work with local law enforcement, one particular department, our sheriff department, the head sheriff, is that's an actual elected official, so that automatically brings certain nuances to it that can bring challenges that you'll want to think about. And another thing, ultimately, as I'm concluding, that I would have to say, and I think, believe it or not, this is one of the most critical things when you get relationships going, is commit to working through difficult situations, disagreements, and et cetera. By the pure nature of a school system which is designed for the total purpose of educating, to be combined with and collaborating with a law enforcement agency that is designed to serve and protect through enforcing rules and regs, there are difficult situations that will arise, but I say right off the bat, if you commit to working through them from both sides, you normally can work through them. They happen quite often, but we have processes, and through building relationships, we've been able to stand the test of time for over a few years now. We've been able to do that. So again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and so at this time, I want to turn it over to one of my other co-presenters.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Halavosa with the Gainesville Police Department. And I've got just a few slides I'm going to present, and probably within the slides I'm going to add some comments. So just real briefly, my experience, like Mina talked about at the beginning, is as a detective division, I think is mostly where I served about 28 of my 30 years in law enforcement. My last 4 have been in community and youth services, and I think it's at that point I sort of had this epiphany in terms of why we were doing some of the stuff that we were actually doing. So we were really challenging maybe some of our practices here in Gainesville. So Gainesville, Florida is located in north central Florida, home of the Fighting Gators, and we have about 307 sworn officers and probably 100 civilians. And our population is about 140,000, probably more like 160 when the students are in town. So just a quick snapshot maybe of the community that we police. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was redefining the role of law enforcement. So I think by and large, and I'm going to speak to the law enforcement lens, and I want to, this also can connect to the educational lens as well, through teachers and deans, superintendents, principals, however you define your employees at your school. So we in law enforcement, I think about 6 or 7 years ago, especially in this community, we had to take a hard look at our legitimacy in terms of how we evolved, and we had to understand what we were seeing and why we were seeing it. So I think that's an important piece for everybody to understand, especially in the schools when they're embarking on some of these gang issues, because like they talked about earlier in the presentation, gangs are really synonymous for other disparities maybe that your community is experiencing. So there's a lot of reasons that kids join gangs, and being in a gang, like they said earlier, is not illegal. And quite frankly, I haven't found any real gang training that applies to everybody. I think all of our communities, we have different needs, different issues, different histories, different cultures, and consequently, you have to see what fits best in your community and what works the best. And there is no one solution or one size fits all for any of these issues. So I'm always sharing some of the stuff that we've been involved in here in Gainesville that we feel as though has been effective. And if some of this works for you, great. And I'd be happy to share more of this information at a later time. So again, one of the things I believe in, and I think that teachers especially need to understand what they're seeing and why they're seeing it in terms of some of the neighborhoods that these kids are coming out of and showing up in their school, and maybe some of the trauma or the neglect that they're experiencing in their families or in their homes, in their neighborhoods. And I think we all have to understand again, what we're responding to and why we're responding to it. The example I give to officers is that, people just don't naturally wake up and say, you know what, I think I want to live in Section 8 housing. I want my son to be in a gang. I want my daughter to be pregnant. I want to be unemployed and uneducated. And that's just not naturally how people, but that's sort of the environment that these kids are going back to or showing up every single day. And so consequently in our schools, we're actually seeing the outcome of all that other trauma and adverse childhood experiences that's going on those individuals while they're at home and in their communities and in their families. So I think it's really important to understand, again, the history of your community and what you've inherited. And so the challenge, I think, in law enforcement, we're always looking at, really when you police and having policed for over 35 years, I guess, you always look at some of those communities that you're still policing. And believe me, they were probably still policing those communities before I became an officer back in 1985. I will also tell you that I think schools have a lot of the same issues, in terms of how productive those schools are, in terms of however you're gauging your success in your communities and your schools. I know, you're, tracking your instance in your schools is one way to look at, success or failure, but you're also looking at testing these kids to see how they're achieving academically. So that's another measurement that we in law enforcement don't use, but it's important for the schools. And how can we in law enforcement contribute to the success of your schools? And that's the part I hope to share with you today. So again, I mentioned understanding your community, the origin of gangs in your community. In Gainesville, we don't have as much of an issue with some of the more national gangs such as the Gangster Disciples or the MS-13, Bloods and Crips, but we do have hybrid neighborhood gangs that pop up regularly that have different names based on their streets, their neighborhood, something they see in the media, maybe a song. So we see that pretty regularly appear in our communities, I think, and it's really with some of the younger kids. And I know Oscar was talking about some of the middle school kids, and I think that's what we're really starting to see emerge and evolve in our community. So also, we want to, one of the strategies to keep kids in school, and I think that was something that we've experienced over the last 5 or 10 years, and I think we're just slow to respond because obviously in law enforcement, as quickly as we were to arrest somebody in somebody's home or to arrest a child in a school because he or she wouldn't put their phone away, I think we realized that it's not our job really to play that role. Because when we show up at somebody's home and their child won't go to school or they're having an issue with their child, I think, our response, especially in the state of Florida, has always quickly reduced to, arresting the child. And so we're starting to back away from that sort of response. And I think the schools are as well, because the idea really is to keep kids in school. So we've, again, capitulated a little bit. We're still saying, hey, if you have an issue, you can always call us, but we're showing up more in terms of being counselors and intervention specialists and life coaches and less so much as being that disciplinarian for that family or for that school. Because I think we need to, like I mentioned at the beginning, you know, our number one priority is public safety and school safety. But again, what is our role when we respond to some of this behavior that we're seeing in these schools? So obviously, if you don't already have an in-school suspension program, that's one thing that we worked on over the last 3 years. We created an in-school suspension. We obviously have an alternative school here in Alachua County, which is the county that serves Gainesville. We have 21 school resource officers. So we have the high schools, we have the middle schools, we have 11 elementary schools, and we have 2 alternative schools that we have school resource officers in. So I've got some data at the end of my presentation, which I'll share with you. And again, you know, we can only measure so much, I think, from the law enforcement perspective, but it's more about sort of redefining what is our role in these schools. And I think we've, again, acquiesced a little bit and allowed the schools, through their code of conduct, maybe to handle a lot of the discipline issues that are going on in the schools. So that was the MOU that we came up with the schools. But at the same time, we also involved other partners in the community that Oscar talked about. You know, we wanted our mental health experts, you know, our social workers. You know, we wanted after-school activities, you know, Boys and Girls Club, Big Brothers, Big Sisters. So when you talk about what resources you have in your community, you have to be inclusive of everybody, because everybody plays a role ultimately in the success of these youth being successful. And again, what success looks like, you know, that's probably for another webinar. You know, it's important to understand that all of these kids that are being raised in your community and raised by your teachers and law enforcement, I mean, we just have to help support those families, you know, and empower those families to do better. But all these kids that are now showing up on our radar with law enforcement, and we're probably sometimes, and I don't know what you're dealing with in your particular state or your community, but some of these kids do get shipped off to programs for 8 months or a year, but all these kids are coming back, okay? They're not coming back to Gainesville, Florida, and then moving to Montana or something like that. So we have to be smart and realize that we can't just expel kids from school or dismiss them, because once we kick kids out of the educational piece of it, which I'm a big advocate of, then that's when we start to see our real issues in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and that's when our police officers really have to work a lot harder that aren't assigned to the schools. So the other thing on this slide I talk a little bit about is really reinforcing trauma training, you know, again, adverse childhood experiences, civil citations. If you don't have a separate sort of accountability system in your community for your youth, I think you really need to look at creating one. OJJDP has a lot of information on civil citations and alternatives to arrest. I really recommend that you look at alternatives. So there's still an accountability, and I think if you look at those recidivism rates, in Alachua County and Gainesville, we have what's called teen court. So a youth is entitled to 3 civil citations, which is if he or she commits a misdemeanor in lieu of an arrest, they'll send him to teen court. And I think our recidivism rate in that program is about 3%. I think our recidivism rate when we ship kids off to placement programs or to children's prisons is about 60%. So we can see the real benefit of keeping kids in their community and working with those families. Obviously, this is training that we've gone through: fair and impartial policing, restorative justice, implicit bias, but really trauma and neglect and understanding, again, what I mentioned at the first slide, why are you seeing what you're seeing? I also encourage you to embrace restorative justice. Again, this is sort of a holistic approach to resolving some of the issues, and I'll give you a quick example. If you have a fight at your bus stop, you know, law enforcement traditionally or typically would show up and identify, you know, the primary aggressor. We make that arrest, and that would be the end of our case for the day. Now, understanding these 2 youth that are fighting at the bus stop probably obviously go to the same school. Maybe they share the same classrooms. They probably came from the same neighborhood, and they might be neighbors. And so there's a lot more that they do together. So the idea when you're having issues that involve crimes of violence, I really encourage you to take a look at restorative justice measures that brings everybody to the table in terms of who was impacted by that behavior. For instance, the parents might have been impacted. The mom, now this child gets suspended or can no longer take the school bus. The mom doesn't have a car. The teacher was impacted because that student's no longer in class. So everybody's impacted or affected by a child's behavior is now brought to the table, and you have a restorative justice model. So if you're not embracing that or you are practicing that, I certainly would encourage you to take a look at some of the efforts and the outcomes. And by and large, I can tell you about 90% of the restorative justice conferences that we've had have been very successful. I'll talk real briefly about, again, this paradigm shift in law enforcement in terms of, typically we viewed ourselves that have been trained quasi-military, maybe as warriors, and obviously you'll never hear me suggest that there'd be a reduction in high-risk training, active shooting training, defensive tactics. In fact, it's the opposite. I think we still need a lot more, especially in the state of Florida now, with active shooting training. So we're actually going through that with our schools right now. And if you haven't gone down that road yet, seriously, Florida's got a lot that we've learned over the last 11, 12 months that we'd be happy to share with you in terms of some of our responses and what we're doing and some of our training and ALICE training. So I would invite you to reach out to me if you were looking for something like that. And again, we want to make sure that at the same time we have the warrior training, but we also have this guardianship. We have empathy, we have a heart. And cops, unfortunately, nowadays we have to wear both hats. And I think that's the expectation of the community. I know the community expects us to solve all these crimes, but they measure us really in terms of playing basketball with children. So that's his reality in law enforcement. That's sort of a shift in how we're responding and the expectations of the community and how we respond. One of the things, I'll talk briefly, a couple of the programs that we run here, we do what's called a police youth dialogue. You could probably double those numbers. I think we've hit over 600 youth, over 500 officers. The county does them as well, and we do these monthly. So we bring in 10 to 12 at-risk youth. So it could be kids that are on probation. It could be youth that have been referred to you through the schools, to the officers in your community. A number of ways you can refer youth. And then we have 10 to 12, which I like to call at-risk cops, because everybody comes into this training thinking the training's for the other person, when in fact it's for everybody, really just to break down some barriers and stereotypes. And we as officers know that people's perceptions are our realities, and so there's preconceived notions. Whatever happens in, I use Oscar in Spokane, now affects what happens in Gainesville. Now that wasn't the case 10 years ago or 12 or 15 years ago, but that's the case now. So we just have to be aware and understand why some of the kids feel about us the way we feel. But it's just impressive to have these dialogues. They're about 5 hour. We come away with a lot of, mea culpas and exchanging phone numbers and good relationship building. And it's not the answer. It's not the panacea. It's just something that we felt, our chief felt about 6 or 7 years ago, that we just we didn't understand some of the youth that we were responding to, and the youth didn't understand us as well. So that's why we've engaged. We still engage. And again, it's about making deposits in your community. But you can do entire classrooms. And we've also done dialogues with teachers and students, which have been fantastic, and we've done parents and students, which have been fantastic. So it's a good model that we've used, that we keep using all the time. And I'd be happy to share additional information. Reach out to me if you're interested. We've done it at our university and our community college. Now, your community college benefit because most of the kids in your community go to your community college. That's a little different from your university, especially here in Florida. A lot of our kids, a lot of our youth are not really from this community. So again, it's additional information. Again, system of care, again, 6 or 7 years ago when we embarked on some of these changes, one thing we realized, we evolved from disproportionate minority contact to the school to prison pipeline to the system of care. Now what this is, a monthly meeting that we drive because we feel like when law enforcement calls all these stakeholders to come meet, they all come. So it's beneficial. We have the facilities, we have the equipment to really house these kind of meetings. So once a month, we really address all these other wraparound services that these youth require. So again, when you're talking about gangs, looking at what else is driving that behavior, in terms of mental health, in terms of clothing, housing, transportation, what's happening with that youth and their family. I know it sounds like it's comprehensive and it's complicated. That's because it is. And so I think it's important this is what's working for us, is our system of care. And again, I'm the one that kind of spearheads it. I'm the one that brings everybody together. And we talk about all these different issues that we're seeing in our community. So I would just share, and again, additional information can be shared with you if that's something that you are interested in as well. Quick other policies that we've engaged in. We don't arrest kids that are 12 years of age and younger. We don't feel like they have the cognitive ability to appreciate it. If you look at some of our data at the end of the slide presentation, you'll see how we really just reduced our arrests in schools. Obviously, if there's a gun brought to school, or if there's a lewd lascivious, a sexual battery, extensive bullying, we will make arrests. But by and large, we allow the school with ours. We write reports, but we allow the school to, and we have a state statute here in Florida that allows the school to handle some of this discipline. We also give the officers, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of discretion in terms of domestic violence. They don't have to arrest a child because kids and parents, it's not that intimacy issue that we saw back in the late 80s that we were experiencing. So we don't always make arrests on domestics, but we do write the reports. And again, we've enhanced our civil citations. And if there was a suggestion or recommendation, and however you decided to work on this, I applaud you. The 0 to 5 age is, to me, putting more funding into prevention and getting them ready for school. So a lot of our kids that actually we find that join gangs, by the third grade, they're not reading, and they just feel like they're lost in school, and they have anger issues, and they don't want to participate in school anymore. So our goal is to keep them in school. The one program we've been running for the last 5 years is called a HERO program. So we take a particular gang, a group of kids out there every summer, and we do a variety of activities with those youth. We take them to the Mayport Naval Academy. First of all, we pick them up every single morning. And so we keep them with us in law enforcement. We do about 30 different events. We have a basketball team, and we try to just, if you look at the comprehensive gang model, they really have a good, Fort Pierce, Florida is really doing a real good job of just getting involved and being mentor and life coaches. And we're not trying to cultivate sources so that people tell you stuff, but naturally you will develop those relationships with your kids and your community where they will start to trust you. So it's just a natural, organic sort of relationship. And we just finished ours last week for this summer. It was hugely successful. None of the kids got arrested, and we saw a reduction in arrests this year by 63%. The next slide I've got, again, is what we started to do when we embarked on this 7 years ago. We used to arrest kids that were on probation in school. So if they got suspended, one of the conditions of them staying in school was that their probation was that they stay in school. So once they got suspended, we would take them out to the local, county clinker. Why we did that, we didn't know. We just did it. So we just categorically stopped arresting kids on probation that were getting suspended from school, and we let the school handle it. And I think that was an obvious incentive in terms of some of the success that we're having. I will share with you that this idea that if you arrest a ton of kids at your school, you're going to create a good learning environment is kind of a myth. The reality is you arrest less kids in your school, you'll create a better learning environment for those kids, and you'll keep them in school. So again, the last slide I got a lot of data slides. I just put up a couple here, was our response to kids in school. Again, all of our schools, we're an ACE district now. We've all gone up over the last 3 or 4 years alphabetically, and that's how their schools are graded in Florida. But last year we had to make 8 arrests. The year before we made 3, and so you've seen that reduction in terms of how we respond to some of the kids in the school. But we're having, again, a lot of success with these kids in that response. So I know I've covered a lot, but if there's any additional information that you'd like in terms of our school resource officers and how we deal with gangs in our schools, I'd be happy to share what I've learned, what we've learned, what's been successful here, and to see if we couldn't modify it to work for your communities. And I would make myself available to any of the questions that we have. But I want to thank you for letting me speak to you.
Wow, that was a great presentation from everybody. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I wanted to give you all a chance to ask any questions that you may have, and I see that there are some questions already in the box, so we'll get started with that. The first question is, are there any programs that any of the presenters find that work best in reducing gang activity?
William, would you like
Who
to
would
start?
like to answer that?
Sure, this is Will. Yeah, so the best program that we came up with is we've done a great training here in our schools, and that was more of a data collecting, because the community is always asking you for, well, how many gangs do you have, or how many gang members do you have? And it's like, well, let me look at my sign-up sheet here. It's not that easy. It's kind of a unicorn, try to collect that sort of data. But the great program really helped us identify, a lot of what's going on in these schools. But the program that we really embrace and love is just that, from law enforcement, we all have ComStats or data track, and you've identified all these kids that are doing this stuff. Go to their homes, find out what's going on with them, what needs they have, what needs the family has. So I think, not putting them in this category that you're afraid of them just because allegedly they're in a gang. So my HEROES program, I'd probably suggest has been the most beneficial.
Okay. And I would say one thing in particular. I would say one thing in particular that I found of great value was definitely with the GREAT program. In addition to that, pairing it with other type of things, like Will said, even his Heroes program. But another one that I looked at in particular, which is similar, would be some form of mentor programs, which is in your community. I know that they have Big Brothers, Big Sisters. They have various other ones. I don't know what the waiting lists are, but I would target one specifically that has an emphasis on working with the profile of students that you're talking about right now. It's not uncommon, and this may take a little bit more legwork, for there to be an entity in the community or a group of people who may have backgrounds in being gang involved, who have a patch, who have cleaned up their lives, and who really want to give back and prevent some of the same things happen to other students that happen to them. And so I would, connect with local organizations, and I wouldn't discount your faith-based community. By all means, you may find some very passionate individuals ready to partner with you. And another thing, is going to save you on cost too. That's just a side note.
I would also like to add that on the National Gang Center website, we have a tool called the Strategic Planning Tool, and within that there's a program matrix. It looks at the research on an evaluation on various programs around the country, and puts them into matrices of risk factors and target age groups, and risk and protective factors. And you can look through that matrix. We're always adding to it. Every year we go through a research project and add to it, but that will also help inform you on how to select programs that will help reduce gang activity, or at least work with juvenile delinquents.
Thank you, Mina, and everybody. Has anyone had contact with restorative justice liability claims in civil court?
No.
No. This is Oscar. I will say no, and I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, is, and help me out, so since I'm within the school, someone actually using restorative practices or justice to kind of, instead of going down a more punitive route, to kind of address the behavior? Is this the question? I don't know if it can be confirmed or not. That end up leading to a court case or anything like that?
Hey, this is Will. So you can have referrals from the state attorney or district attorney for a restorative justice. So you can have those kind of referrals where somebody's already been arrested, or you can resolve it, like I said, where you come up with agreements before anybody gets arrested, and if the victim is satisfied with the restorative justice outcomes, then you don't have to file that case. So there's a number of ways that you can approach that, and I guess that was the question.
Okay. Because I'll say within the schools, something, I'm sorry, who is that?
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I'll say within the schools, uniquely, when we begin to start looking at restorative justice or restorative practices, we're oftentimes using it. That's like our main philosophy or paradigm shift that we have, but it in no means that for more egregious behaviors, like, as Will said, a gun being brought to school, some type of other forms of violence, that we do not bring forth a type of consequence that we need to pure law or stuff. So I just want to make sure I put that out there. We just make sure restorative practices or justice is a part of that process.
Yeah, and Oscar, if I could add to that too, if you think about the trauma that's created in a school environment when a gun comes to school, every parent there is traumatized, every child that goes to that, every teacher. I mean, it's very emotional. So obviously, when you make that arrest, a few months down the road, if they decided to have a sit down with that young man or young lady about breathing, then you can have that, and you can have restorative outcomes. But that's not going to be what really dictates the outcome of that case at the state attorney's office. But it's beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, you guys. The next question says, what strategies do prevention and intervention programs use to overcome the voluntary aspects of families and youth being actively involved? Like, how do you engage family and youth into these prevention and intervention programs?
There's no easy solution.
No, I would agree. No easy solution. From the schools, I can tell you for our particular area, prevention, and when I say cross-community collaboration, it end up lending us so many benefits to us. Because uniquely, because of the partnerships that we have across the community with various organizations, agencies, we're able to leverage a lot of times our social capital as well as the relationship as a preventative measure, which is awesome. Like when we run into, as an example, like say if we have a particular kiddo middle school who is talking about, who's starting to display certain type of characteristics, hanging out in certain areas that start to make us feel concerned, because of the cross-community collaboration, there are multiple people who are standing by, who are waiting for a phone call, and often it's not uncommon for when one individual, if like someone calls and say, hey, Johnny is doing such and such, someone within the network is going to know probably someone connected to Johnny's family. So we can provide prevention and actually get involved with intervention sometimes in a very expedient manner. So.
Do you all conduct home visits on occasion?
We have individuals who do connect home visit. When I said the mentoring program that we have, the mentor makeup is individuals. One of them was out of LA, who is known for kind of starting he's of age right now, but he was known as higher up in one of the particular ones. And so him and the other group, being guided by myself as well as other law enforcement, they're doing home visits. They're at different places. They're going to hot spots. They're doing various things for us.
Thanks. That's great. Thank you, Oscar.
Mm-hmm.
Another question says, I would like more information on this dialogue program. I guess we could get that sent in the other chat box if somebody has that, if Nina or one of you guys can send that. So let's see. How do you...
They're referring to Will's Gainesville program.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Okay,
my email... Yeah, I'll put my email address on here. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Will.
And there was also a question there earlier about post-traumatic stress regarding MS-13. I saw that earlier. I don't see it anymore, but we don't have much experience here in Gainesville. I can tell you that my wife is from El Salvador, so I'm very familiar with the family dynamic in Fort Lauderdale and how strong those families and those relationships are. So I think there's got to be, the only way to really breach or to get involved in those sort of discussions is within the El Salvadorian communities, have those, because there's a lot of folks with a lot of relatives, I can tell you, even on my wife's side, and I think they're starting to really engage in some of that discussion in Broward County and Fort Lauderdale regarding some of those issues. But that's post-traumatic stress from what they've experienced in El Salvador and San Salvador. He's correct, the gentleman that mentioned about some of the post-traumatic stress from these kids coming up from Central America.
Thank you, Will. Another question here says, how do you approach community providers to attend SOC meetings?
Well, that starts at the top. If you're not engaged, if your chief or your board of directors or somebody's not engaged or wants to approach stuff, someone's got to figure it out in your community, you're wasting your time with that person, I think, for the most part. But I know that doesn't answer the question. But you really got to go to the top, because if your top administrators aren't buying into some of these efforts, at least, you might be spinning your wheels. So I don't know exactly what discipline is not showing up or for what reason, but our community, probably like a lot of communities on this phone call, are based on, what Oscar talked about earlier, relationships. And I think that's how we get folks to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And also, add to what Will said, understanding the culture. Taking time to really understand the culture of the community provider, the organization, can really help with what's going on, because I'm not saying that sometimes individuals intentionally miss meetings, but if you are an individual, an administrator, a head leading an organization, you're being invited to a lot of different types of meetings in the community. And if it just so happens there's not a connection, as Will said, in relationship, as well as it's not a full understanding, sometimes you can be prioritized as being a little lower than what you should be, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And this last question says, do you know of any grants in the state of Georgia for these programs or anything for kids? I can say that you can check the federal website for federal grants, OJJDP.gov. You can check our funding opportunities for gang prevention, intervention, suppression grants. I'll throw it out there to you all. Do you know of any other grants in the state of Georgia?
No, we are not aware of other grants in the state of Georgia, but I do know that gang prevention, gang intervention, and gang suppression is a very high priority in Georgia, and so I'm sure that there are developing resources there.
Great, thank you, Mina. One last question just came in. How can researchers partner with the National Gang Center, schools, and law enforcement?
Just contact us. Yeah, just contact us. You can contact us through my through my email or through our website, nationalgangcenter.gov.
Thank you, Nina.
Sure.
And one last question here, or two last questions. Is there information in the guide that can assist with developing an MOU for school administration and local law enforcement to work with advocates for mentors with a past criminal history who would like to work with youth in the community and schools?
So we don't, in that guide, we talk about MOUs, but we don't do any kind of a deep dive into how to develop them, like you said, but there are technical assistance that we could provide or resources that we could send you to work on that.
Okay. And finally, will anyone be at the upcoming National Gang Conference in Chicago? Will any of you three be there?
No.
No. This is Oscar. Not at this time.
This is Will, no.
Okay, well, I want to thank the audience for participating and sending in questions. I want to thank our presenters again for participating on this webinar. And this concludes our webinar for today, and I'll turn it back over to you, Will, in case you have anything else you want to add for the participants.
Yeah, sure. Steffi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. Yeah, well, thank you all, and we appreciate you all for joining us for today. Very great discussion. Thank you very much, Steffi, as our moderator. I also want to thank our presenters, Oscar, Will, and Mina, for a great discussion on this topic. But before everyone leaves, we do just have a few brief announcements for you all. Please note that you may contact NTTAC through the website displayed on this slide. You can stay up to date on the latest information by signing up for NTTAC's TTA listserv. Also, don't forget to check us out on Facebook at OJJDP TTA. You may also contact OJJDP via the Help Desk by following the contact information on this slide. Do you have and technical assistance in need? If so, please visit JDP's 60 platform to submit a request. The location for the website for that platform is here on this slide. As a reminder to our audience, the webinar recording will be posted on OJJDP's NTTAC YouTube channel. Contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk for the transcript and supporting materials. Also, for others, in the very beginning, we did have some tech difficulties. So for folks who didn't get a chance to enter in or type in the number of additional people that is with them in the room today, you can do so at this time as well. So if you missed out and didn't get a chance to type in the total number of additional people that you have in the room with you today, you could do that at this time as well. If everyone could, please take a moment to review the disclaimer here. And lastly, we would appreciate if you could take about 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Everyone, have a great afternoon. Goodbye.